30 years ago, no Brazilian intellectual, politician, or business leader would have been foolish enough to accept the popular media as their main source of information. The basis of our factual diet was books, specialized magazines, direct investigations in archives and documents. Newspapers were merely consumer items, secondary material of relative or dubious value. Radio was only useful for weather forecasts. Television was for housemates. At the very least, there was always a distinction between genuine information and its pasteurized version adapted to the taste of the masses. Today, I'm astonished to see the total trust, the bovine credulity with which educated first-rate men take newspapers and television as the basis for their worldview, even going so far as to question any primary source that hasn't been endorsed by Folha or Jornal Nacional. Once, while discussing with a high-ranking military officer who, on top of it all, had been an intelligence officer, I asked him whether he had read certain books essential to the subject we were debating. No, he hadn't read any of them. So where do you get your information from? I asked. And he, with the dumbest look, I read the newspaper, UAI. UAI, I say. I really am the remnant of an extinct race. No wonder my name, of Norwegian origin, means survivor. I often feel that I've already died, that my soul has crossed worlds, that I came back from beyond, and I'm trying to talk to newborn little Indians, still lost in their narrow, earthly environment, persuaded that the forest is the cosmos. When you open the opinion section of a newspaper, or even the cultural section, you don't find anything there that isn't a translation, in ideas or mockeries of ideas, of the universe of facts already presented in the news pages of the same paper. And when you read the news, it confirms those same opinions. In universities, on TV interviews, in parliamentary debates, nothing is heard that isn't merely an expansion, or rather, a vegetative bloating, of this material. It's all a perfect redundancy, circular, closed, repetitive, and eternally self-devouring. Any authentic novelty, any outside element that manages to get in is expelled by a battalion of antibodies that cast it back into the darkness of non-existence. No one knows anything that others don't already know. No one says anything that others haven't already said or aren't eager to say. Curiously, for those who live within this atmosphere, the very thinness of its content becomes a tremendous source of security. General ignorance validates individual ignorances, which in turn validate it back, producing the impression of generalized omniscience. Hence this impressive phenomenon, typically Brazilian, for which no similar case can be found in the world. The radically ignorant academic intellectual, semi-illiterate, unaware even of his own language, who is consulted on 1,001 subjects, makes disciples, and becomes an indispensable reference, a maitre à penser, a guru. Of course, things work differently in the USA. Here, opinion and analysis magazines are so numerous that even TV commentators must keep themselves more or less at their level or be discredited by the first interviewee. And even the politicians who are interested in reinforcing the prestige of the mainstream media, in order to be reinforced by it in return, know that it's all theater. One thing is to enjoy being featured in the New York Times. Another is to make decisions based on what it publishes. And the scrutiny over the mainstream media is so intense that no one above the average level of the population will believe what comes out in a newspaper or TV broadcast without first checking its word against that of the respective media watch sites. The unstoppable decline in the circulation of major newspapers, alongside the growth of electronic journalism, reflects not only a technological shift, but also the inevitable preference for the medium that allows the fastest comparison of a variety of sources and their respective analyses. On a computer screen, you can read a piece of news in 15 different versions within minutes. Not even television allows that. TV newscasts are not synchronized, and when they are, you can't watch several of them at once without missing something. On the computer, you can go back and forth between 10, 20, 30 news pages, quickly grasping the plurality of versions and perspectives. Hence the printed media's increasing bet on long analytical articles, which are easier to read on paper than on screen, though that doesn't prevent them from being simultaneously published online, or on daily or semi-daily columns, where the reader becomes accustomed to the voice and tone of their favorite columnists. I say voice because many columns are also read on the radio. And these columnists are generally excellent, perfect masters of the English language, writers in the fullest sense of the word, always bringing some novelty that at least breathes life into the general discussion. In Brazil, on the contrary, these full-page articles in the Diário do Comércio are notable exceptions. In general, what increasingly predominates is journalism in pills, minimalist fragments compressed into dimensions appropriate for an audience for whom reading is a torment and whose supreme, declared and confessed model is the President of the Republic himself. In this cramped space, there is no room for you to prove anything. The most one can do is summarize a loose opinion, isolated, devoid of the slightest justification. I think this, I think that, I like such a thing, I hate another. And that's it. The idea of demonstration, investigation, proof and counterproof has already disappeared from the public's mind to the point that any attempt at a longer argument seems like stalling or pedantry. When something is challenged, it's only a matter of preferences, an I love opposed to an I abhor, or vice versa, or else points of detail, irrelevant to the central discussion. In fact, there is no central discussion. What exists is merely an exchange of affections and disaffections on the periphery of the world. The worst part is that when I try to explain this to Americans, they don't understand. They can only conceive of two things: either a media amputated, shackled, and standardized by official censorship, or the varied profusion of viewpoints seen in a normal democracy. They can't grasp that a country could have so many newspapers, so many magazines, so many TV channels, so many universities, so many electronic journalism sites, and no real discussion. When I say that in Brazil not only is dissenting opinion marginalized, but the evidence that supports the dissent is expelled from the discussion, they ask me if there is a KGB controlling everything. When I inform them that there isn't, they no longer know what I'm talking about. The pure power of stupidity, the spontaneous dictatorship of self-satisfied ignorance, is beyond their imagination. The Brazilian mental KGB cannot exist in the known world, only on planet Brazil. It is a cosmic mystery beyond comprehension. Folha de São Paulo is a fat pro-communist pamphlet, lying to the point of hallucination. I only read that garbage to assess daily the progress of national mendacity, the cancerous growth of Brazilian intellectual shamelessness. When that newspaper whines that its rights have been violated by government agents, it forgets all the services it has rendered to the establishment of a communist dictatorship in the country, through the incessant defamation of all anti-communism and the systematic omission of news that might lead readers to see things in their proper proportions. Mr. Otávio Frias Filho seems to want communism for everyone and capitalism only for himself. Perhaps he believes it's possible to turn the entire country communist while maintaining a little island of free market on Alameda Barão de Limeira. Several times a week, his newspaper, made by and for cream puff boys, comes out with some new anti-military or anti-American scandal. Always and invariably it's a lie. Either it's a substantive lie, a material alteration of the facts, or it's a qualitative lie, that is, a modification of proportions and perspectives. In the latter case lies the news trumpeted in that tone of indignation which has already become in Brazil the official badge of the Union of the Virtuous. Secret documents from American diplomacy only now revealed show that the Richard Nixon administration, 1969-74, knew about torture in Brazil in 1973-74. The U.S. ambassador in Brasilia, John Crimmins, suggested that Nixon not cut off credit to Brazil as retaliation for the abuses. This could hinder the strategy of influencing Brazilian politics and the sale of arms to the country. The ambassador recommended that the Nixon government not use Article 32 of the Foreign Assistance Act against the Brazilian government, although the report itself acknowledged that this was legally possible. Under that rule, the U.S. could cut financial credits to Brazil in retaliation for alleged human rights abuses. American pressure against the abuses only began during Jimmy Carter's administration, 1977 to 1981. That is to say, the wicked American government could have tied the hands of the Brazilian torturers, but refused to do so because it was more interested in making money selling weapons to them. To begin with, Folha takes as objective truth the numbers provided by pro-communist entities, 376 dead, but attributes to the critics of leftist groups the counting of victims of terrorism. and it provides the total number of communists killed throughout the entire time of the dictatorship, but stops counting their victims in 1974, obtaining 119 corpses. In the leftist list, it does not distinguish between those who died in shootouts, accidents, or assassinated in prisons, thus giving the impression that all were unarmed victims of state violence. When speaking of communist victims, it does not even remotely mention cases such as Lieutenant Alberto Mendez Jr. and militants condemned as traitors who died tied up. The impression left is that young leftist idealists fought in the streets with open chests, while the cowardly government, hidden in sinister basements, was mostly occupied with mistreating unarmed people. This is not journalism. It is Globo soap opera, fictional construction, myth. As invariably happens, the institutions supplying data on dictatorship deaths are presented as religious, cultural, or human rights entities, with no allusion to their ideological identity, even when they are openly partisan and militant, while the sources of information on terrorism victims are shown by their ideological color, even when they have no political activity. The reader ends up believing that everything said against the dictatorship comes from neutral, impartial, and reliable sources, while every accusation against the communists comes marked by ideological bias. It is the exact inversion of reality. The quantitative evaluation is also always wrong. In light of the sense of proportions, 376 casualties over 20 years of fighting a military government in a country of continental proportions is an incredibly modest number, not only compared to any guerrilla warfare in the world, but compared to Cuban repression of the unarmed population. Fidel Castro killed that number of people every 2 months, in fact with the help of Brazilian terrorists, who never saw anything wrong in that. It is not appropriate to forget that the national dictatorship did not imprison more than 2,000 political prisoners over 2 decades, while Cuba, with a population much smaller than Brazil's, reached 100,000 simultaneously. Before pretending scandal at the numbers of repression in Brazil, Folha should consider the alternative offered by the terrorists. The democratic alternative did not exist. The struggle was between the most sanguinary dictatorship in the continent, which financed and coordinated guerrillas from Havana, and an authoritarian government improvised to stop, with the least possible violence, the communist rise determined to kill an unlimited number of people hasta la victoria siempre. The article also does not provide the necessary points of comparison to give the facts their due significance. The U.S. never cut credits to the USSR or China, where unarmed prisoners suffering torture and state homicide numbered in the millions. Why should it do so in the case of a country where the supposed victims were no more than a few dozen, almost all terrorists caught in the act of homicide? The historical perspective of the facts is also totally falsified. The impression given to the reader is that the Washington government, omnipotent controller of the Brazilian dictatorship, did not do what it could to restrain the violence of its local henchmen, ready to yield at the first threat of commercial sanctions. In fact, American prestige before the Brasilia government was at one of the lowest points in its history. By initiative of Chancellor Azevedo de Silveira, a historical leftist, the high posts of Itamaraty were all filled by communist sympathizers, soon significantly nicknamed Little Bearded Ones by their colleagues, in a direct allusion to the plethora of unshaven beards in the Cuban revolutionary elite. President Geisel, anxious to mark a difference, clearly tended to a third-worldist and anti-American policy, approaching China, giving preference to Germany as supplier of materials for the construction of the ill-fated Angra dos Reis nuclear plant, and, to top it off, supplying weapons and money to help Cuba invade Angola. The most hostile decision to the U.S. ever taken by a Brazilian president before or after that, near which the nationalist bravado of Jânio Quadros and João Goulart shrinks to mere diplomatic farts. Commercial sanctions, at that point, would sound like intolerable provocations. Far from restraining state violence, they would only create more hostility towards the U.S. No government in the world would take that risk to defend a few dozen individuals, after all their enemies. The impression of moral scandal that Folha wants to create around Ambassador Crimen's messages is entirely forced and artificial. Regarding the arms sales to Brazil, which Folha presents as the self-interested motive behind the American decision not to interfere in the local situation, one must be very idiotic to believe that it had great commercial value for the U.S., to the point of determining diplomatic decisions merely out of desire for money. This trade was important because, at that point, it was the last point of contact where the American government and the Brazilian military had common interests, being absolutely necessary to preserve it as a basis for a possible rebuilding of good relations between the two countries. Any ambassador with an IQ above 12 would have recommended to his government what Crimmins recommended to Nixon. Trying to see greed motives, there is puerile malice, the full hostile equivalent of intelligence. And Jimmy Carter did not pressure the Brazilian authorities out of sincere concern for human rights. He was always a protector of bloody communist dictators. What he wanted to prevent was the total defeat of the Latin American guerrilla, which, thanks to him, survived the period of repression and flourished without limits in the following decades, ending up creating the largest Latin American military force and elevating itself to the status of monopolistic dominator of drug trafficking on the continent with the help of Bill Clinton's Plan Colombia.